Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Founders and Funding. If we haven't met before, I'm Alex Norman. I'm the co-founder of TechTO. I'm an operator with 2 exits. Spent some time doing professional services, advising enterprises on growth and technology. I'm an active investor as the head of Canada for AngelList and the partner at N49P. For those of you tuning in for the first time, we host Founders and Funding to help demystify the fundraising process and the relationship between investors and founders. We find there's a lot of information on the web, a lot of blogs, a lot of podcasts, but usually get it as a shiny version and a point in time. We try to make sure these chats get you the whole truth and the unvarnished truth and tell you what it's like to work together. Usually we do this every 2 weeks, but we're having a special episode today, which I'm super excited about. We have Matt Clifford, a co-founder at EF, and Benedict Evans, a venture partner at EF, to come talk about investing, technology more in general, about EF in particular. I'm super excited for this. Both are super accomplished and will bring a unique perspective. First of all, they'll have a bit nicer accent than me because they're both from the UK. And then Matt is co-founder of Entrepreneurs First, which is the world's leading talent investor. He writes a weekly newsletter, Thoughts in Between, on how the world got to the way it is and how it's changing. He co-founded and sits on the board of Code First Girls, and he spent some time at McKinsey. Second, we're going to have Benedict Evans, who is an internationally renowned technology analyst based in London. He has spent 20 years analyzing mobile, digital media, and technology. He's worked in investment banking, as strategy consultant. He was most recently a venture capitalist at A16Z, and he is now a venture partner at EF. I'm an avid reader of everything Benedict writes because I find he's crisp, direct to the point, and insightful. It's my pleasure. I'm going to hand it over to Matt and Benedict to take it from here.
Thanks, Alex.
Hey, Alex,
and thanks, Benedict, for joining me. I'm really excited.
Matt, can you check your settings?
Oh, you can't hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you. Let's go, Benedict. Well, they'll tell us if we're messing up. So, Benedict, it's great to be here. We're going to jump into, I think, a very broad conversation about all things tech, but just by way of introduction to the audience. Entrepreneur First is as Alex said, a talent investor. We find individuals, maybe like you, who want to start companies and help them find co-founders and build companies from scratch. We have been live in Toronto for about a year now, and we're very excited that we'll be unveiling our first cohort on May the 25th. That is the first group of companies to graduate through our program. If you are interested in seeing them, meeting them, you can find out more about them on our website. If you're an investor and want to get to know them, we can help you navigate them. And if you're interested in applying for our next cohort in Canada, that kicks off in September. But without further ado, we're going to jump right into it. Now, as Alex says, Benedict is renowned for his newsletter and his crisp and to the point views. I'll say there, we've got a link to the first cohort if you want to see it from Maya. So I want to jump straight into the content, and what I thought first we could talk about, Benedict, is e-commerce. Now, I think the numbers all suggest it's been, for obvious reasons, the pandemic's played a massive role in boosting online sales over the last year. But you've written recently about whether we should expect this to persist post-pandemic. And I wondered if maybe we could open by thinking through that. Like, is this a secular shift or is it a one-off pandemic boom?
Now, I've never quite understood why people say secular shift as opposed to temporal shift. But anyway, maybe it's like societal. So, yeah, I mean, we kind of had like a kind of I think in an awful lot of sectors, we had this kind of moment of sort of forced experiment and forced adoption and forced acceleration last year. And everyone had to try and do everything online. And some of it will stick, not all of it. Like we won't carry on doing things exactly the way we did them in April last year, but we also won't go back to 2019. And that applies to video calls and business travel and conferences and all sorts of, and online dating and all sorts of stuff. In e-commerce, like the numbers I'm most familiar with are that the UK went from about 20% to about 30%, and the US went from sort of 16% to sort of low 20s. Some sectors have jumped a lot more. UK online grocery kind of doubled in most places. In the UK, it went from about 5% to about 10%. In the US, about half that. And I think what that kind of happens, there's a couple of things that happen now. Like one of them is it sort of crystallizes the realization that this stuff has gone from being something that some people do for some categories to something that everybody will do for any category if you can come up with the right business model, the right experience, the right logistics model, and so on. Anyone will buy anything online. That's not the same as everyone will buy everything online. Second, I think you've got two splits within that. One of them is around what the buying experience is, where, do you want the kind of pure commodity of Amazon where I know exactly what I want? I go to Amazon, I type in the SKU and I get the SKU. Or do I want experience, recommendation, discovery, curation, expertise, experience, something else beyond just that kind of pure logistics, pure kind of database with a truck on the end model? And part of the story of e-commerce for the last 20 years has been like converting categories that people thought needed experience and turning out actually you could do them online if you had free shipping or same day shipping or free returns, or you could order 5 sizes and try them all on or something. But even today, like Amazon is like 40% of e-commerce. So like, what's the other 60%? And like a chunk of it is other like logistics-based retailers, but a whole chunk of it is other stuff. And so part of the journey of the last 20 years, the other side of that journey of the last 20 years is like, what experiences can you create? Because Warby Parker is not a logistics company. How do you make it? How do you create that delight online? And that's everything from editorial content to live streaming, to video, to Instagram, to all sorts of other things, which are more like about experience and media and culture than they are about software. The other big split, so you've got this split between logistics and experience. What is the retailer doing? The other split is between parcels and trucks. So you can look at e-commerce and say, what's the penetration of books versus makeup versus shoes versus pet food, say. But you can also say, what's the split of e-commerce or what's the split of retail overall between stuff that could go in a parcel and stuff where you're going to have to go and collect it, or stuff where it has to be a truck, or stuff where it needs to be somebody on a bike. And so it sort of turns out that if you kind of run that analysis, you get sort of, say sort of 50% can be in a parcel, 30% can be you're going to need to deliver it or collect it in some form, which basically means groceries, furniture, white goods, stuff that can't go in the mail, and needs some whole other logistics chain. And like 20% is restaurants,
right,
which also can't go in a parcel. And when you go and look at the numbers, it turns out that somewhere between a third to a half of restaurant spending, particularly in the US, was already this phrase off-prem. Like, it's a nice kind of disconcerting way of referring to restaurants as on-prem and off-prem. So like a third to a half of restaurant spending is already off-prem, but it was analog. It was collection or takeout or delivery. And that very obviously you can switch to software models. It's the same thing. It's just how you make the booking. But that also means that you move to models like dark kitchens and cloud kitchens and virtual brands, and you've got one kitchen that's cooking for 5 different brands or 5 different kinds of food. And does it need to be? It doesn't need to be in the same kind of real estate as a restaurant. Same thing with dark stores. So right now, the hot thing in London is 1-hour grocery delivery. So you've got the giant truck, you've got the big refrigerated truck bringing you your weekly shop. That's one logistics model. But a guy on a moped bringing you an 1-hour shop, like 5 things, that's a different logistics model. And so you've got these 2 different kind of questions. One is, what's the experience of shopping? What's the customer journey like? And the other is, how does it physically get to you? And you've got this kind of bifurcation on both of those.
It's interesting because if you think of that almost like betraying my consulting roots as like a 2x2 of like experience logistics, and then you've got sort of parcel trucks. It almost feels like the naive view would be to say, like some of those are just going to be very pro-incumbent spaces. You need a lot of capital. You need to have existing infrastructure. But actually, it looks like, looking at the funding landscape for startups, that all 4 of those boxes have attracted a lot of new players starting from scratch in the last year or so. Do you see any of those like segments as particularly promising for startups versus like all the gains accrue to Amazon or similar?
Yeah. Well, so I think there's sort of one other level to this, which is across everything I've just said, you've got lots of people making new software. So there's this little company called Shopify that comes from a country.
Someone turned up in Canada, I think. So.
Yeah, well, most people in California couldn't find Canada on a map, I suspect. But Shopify did $120 billion of GMV last year, which is about 40% of Amazon market.
Incredible, yeah.
And I have this conversation with people in antitrust because Shopify is not doing exactly what Amazon does; it's doing something different. And the model, and the sort of general and a specific point here, like the general point is like the competitive threat to a giant tech company is never somebody doing the same thing. It's somebody changing what the market would look like and changing it into something else. And we go back to like Microsoft. Microsoft didn't make IBM irrelevant by making better mainframes. Google didn't make Microsoft irrelevant by making a better PC operating system or better Office suite. Facebook didn't break into Google's market by doing better search. They did some whole other thing. And the same with Shopify versus Amazon. So I think that's one point. I think the second, like much more general point is like it reflects the willingness of consumers and brands to go direct, and it reflects sort of the unbundling of the stack and the ability to sell any individual bit of the e-commerce stack as its own thing, plugged into other bits and pieces, with SaaS and cloud, then with machine learning, and the kind of proliferation of an ecosystem of commerce tooling on top of that. And that happens in everything from shipping to warehousing to stores to sort of every aspect of this. People are kind of poking away trying to carve something out. Maybe sort of one other thing that I think is interesting in Shopify is you can always solve a business, make a new company by taking a solved problem and doing it 10x easier.
Yeah.
And part of what's interesting, and part of what goes on at Shopify is how many customers are not SMEs but giant companies, which is also sort of the digital transformation thing, which is, well, we've got an SAP installation and SAP tell us we can do e-commerce, but like it's not very good.
Yeah, it's interesting, this idea of unbundling the stack. We funded a company in London, an entrepreneur first, called Dishbatch, which is basically making the bet that particularly high-end chefs right now are forced into sort of full stack models to exploit their IP. And actually, if you can find a way to do a lot of the boring bits for them, they can sell not just kind of 50 covers a night, but to anyone anywhere in the world. And if you can ship the meal in a box based on their IP, you've got something there. Until you put it that way, I hadn't thought of it. It's like they basically are just unbundling that stack of what it means to be a high-end restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, part of the kind of it's the old cliche in tech. There's two ways to make money: bundling and unbundling.
Right.
And I mean, this is a joke about video now. What I really want is for somebody to sell me a box I can put under my TV that has a dedicated internet connection and gives me one interface to connect to all of these TV services, and you could call it like cable TV. So there's always that pendulum swinging back and forth. I mean, there is a sort of a pendulum at the moment of disaggregation in software. It's also kind of you move to new stacks and then you build everything again on the new stack. So when you move from Oracle, Windows, client server to cloud, SaaS, web, machine learning, you kind of like you draw a line from everything that got built from like 1990 to 2000 in on-prem data centers, and you just build all of that again.
Yeah. Well, let's you mentioned video, but let's talk about audio. I mean, as well as sort of e-commerce, another huge startup story in the pandemic has been the rise of Clubhouse, which your former colleagues have funded handsomely and has had a great run. How do you think about you've written a bit recently about the future of audio. How do you see this playing out, and particularly the role of Clubhouse as a new player?
So, I mean, I think a little bit of this is like you could take like a kind of 50-foot by 50-foot whiteboard and like just look for white space and fill in a matrix and go, well, what do you do with every sensor on the phone? And, what do you do with every kind of model of interaction? And, we've had a lot of image-based stuff. We've had a lot of video-based stuff. What happens if you have video and take off the video? Like, what happens if it's just audio? It's one way of bringing a Clubhouse is, I think we've all been on Zoom calls where we've kind of thought, well, why do I actually need video here? I would actually rather have the Clubhouse UI where instead of peering at somebody's little thumbnail of their face and trying to work out, is that who's talking on this call? I would rather just have like an icon of their face and an indicator of who's talking. Like, it feels like that would be a much more effective like way of doing the call. I think there's another piece to Clubhouse specifically. Well, so 2 or 3 other things to say about Clubhouse. One of them is how many problems there are with podcasts. And I think, you know, one way to think about podcast is like, imagine if instead of the web, we were using these proprietary FTP apps that downloaded PDFs.
Right.
In each FTP app had like its own hand-coded Yahoo style directory of what the good PDFs were. That's what a podcast is.
Right.
I mean, you get this sealed box of a piece of data that you can't really look inside or link to or do anything with or search. Yes, people are doing indexing. You can't search or link to or copy or do it or remix or do anything with it. Nobody can add any new features because you'd have to persuade all the clients to add the features. So that's all screwed up. There's no discoverability. There's no search. There's no links. There's no social. Like, it's all like, it's like this kind of weird, screwed up, fucked up kind of format. And of course it's open. And kind of some people in tech have like this there's a sort of joke about people in tech have Tourette's syndrome, but instead of saying fuck, they say open or crypto. And that's sort of certainly like podcast has that. So I think that sense of like, but whereas what Clubhouse does is like you create the seal system, where like you can actually add features because you own the whole thing. I think the other interesting part of it is that you have these sort of different, that you kind of break away from all of the models in Twitter and Facebook that lend themselves to abuse. So you don't have retweeting, you don't have comments, you don't have all of those sorts of easy mechanisms for being obnoxious. You can't go viral. You can't have misinformation because you can't spread. You also don't have advertising. They're going to move to a kind of a tipping model. And so I think there's a lot of things about that are kind of interesting in the way that they sort of shift you to this. They sort of shift away from a bunch of things that are a way like kind of Web 2.0 worked. And you could so I could talk about this all day, but like you could plug this into like another narrative, which is sort of the death of cookies, shift away from advertising, shift away from a model of the internet where everything happened on lots of different sites and advertising and content and commerce and discovery and search all happened in different places. And it was all sort of stitched together with cookies and links. And at this point, people start shouting, but privacy, but privacy, but privacy. And of course, so you move everything to this sort of vertical silo where everything happens in one place. You don't have any privacy problems, but you also don't have openness. You don't have linking. You kind of shift to like a different way of thinking about the way the web would work.
I noticed today that Twitter, when I turned it on this morning, it offered me the chance to enable tipping on my profile, which I'd never seen before. I don't know if it's a feature testing thing. I don't think anyone would want to tip me, but it's an interesting idea. And of course, they have their own Clubhouse clone as well, as do Facebook.
Yeah, well, clearly everyone in the Valley is always terrified of what might happen if Twitter pointed its famously effective execution machine at them.
That's very mean, Benedict.
Well, it's a question. I mean, it is a question. I mean, it's fascinating because Twitter had this event like a couple of months ago where they basically said, look, we know we sucked at executing and we sucked at being a partner for the last decade, and we decided it would be a good idea to be good at executing. And you think, okay. Well,
do you have a general way of thinking about this very common occurrence, though, of sort of like sort of insurgent innovator, big tech company with distribution tries to copy? I mean, because Facebook actually has executed a lot of these copying mechanisms pretty well, I would say. How do you think about sort of Clubhouse versus whatever Facebook ends up pushing in the space?
So I think there's like a kind of a generalized question, which is sort of pointed at a kind of a completely different case, which is let's look at something like Apple doing a device discovery system with Find Me and AirTags. And Tile are really upset about this, obviously. But the way I would think about this is if you bought a spreadsheet back in the early 80s, or word processor, it wouldn't have charts. And if you wanted to do charts, that was an extra $200, and $200 in early 80s money. So that's like $500 now. You want to do word count and footnotes in your word processor. Okay, that's $200. There was actually a program called Sideways that was, again, like $150. And what it did was it let you print your spreadsheets in landscape. That was the program. And like, go back another couple of decades, you buy a new car. My father bought a new car, his first car in the 50s. It didn't have turn signals. Like, the reason when you do your driving test, the reason they teach you hand signals is because until like the 80s, cars quite often didn't have a light. You actually would put your hand out. Like, that was the thing. And that's like, so when Ford and General Motors and everybody else put lights in the car, so you would go to a shop and buy them. And you get a drill and a screwdriver, and you spend your Saturday physically adding the turn lights to the back of your car. And when Ford and GM added that, that was really, really unfair to the people who were selling lights. And when Lotus and Microsoft added word counts and footnotes to their word processors, that was really unfair to the people who sold that software. But do we think that means they shouldn't do it? Right. And I think so this is sort of the question. The other side of this is, well, what about when Microsoft added a web browser to Windows? What about when Apple adds streaming music to the iPhone? And so you've got this kind of difficult question of like, does that naturally belong as something that's integrated into the system? Is that the right place for it to be? Or does it naturally belong as an add-on component? And are the people who run the system actually abusing their position, like not letting Spotify sell a subscription, or not? Or is this just like, well, of course it should be part of that? When Microsoft rebuilt Windows with Windows 95, said that you didn't need there was no point in having a third-party memory manager. That put Quarterdeck out of business. Okay, so are we saying that your operating system shouldn't manage its memory for you, so that there can be an opportunity for somebody else to sell your memory manager? Well, so where do you draw the line?
Yeah. All right, let's change gears again. I want to talk about VR briefly. So, I suppose one of the big things that in venture we always look for is like, is there another big platform opportunity? And, VR, at least presumably the reason that Zuck bought Oculus was the idea that maybe VR would be the next big computing platform. As you've written about recently, that sort of hasn't happened yet. VR winter, I think you called it. Like, where do you think we are on that? Will there ever be a VR summer? Could there be?
Well, so you can go back in the time here. So VR and machine learning were both like dumb ideas from the early 90s that had never worked. And until about 2012, if you'd said, I want to work on VR or machine learning, like, what are you talking about? You'll ruin your career. It's a waste of time. And then basically for the same reason for both of them, people realized that this would work now, which is basically Moore's law. Like, we have way more data, way better chips, better screens, better sensors. It would actually work now and not suck. And we spent like the last 7 or 8 years in VR going from like, well, theoretically this would work, but it's still like $5,000, to now the Oculus Quest 2 is $300 and it's really good. It's not like, you don't use it and think it's a beta. You don't make excuses for it. It's a viable consumer product that you can give to somebody. The other side is, what do you do with it? And the problem there is that it is a very good niche games device. It is not yet apparent what else it would be. And there's an argument that this is about the hardware, and you need better sensors so you can head type and you can use your hands, and you need a much higher definition screen so you can see text as well as just seeing game graphics. And that basically, this is Facebook's thesis is, you start with games, you bootstrap up a real user base with that, you keep going until the hardware gets good enough to do text, then suddenly you go pop and you've got this 360 bubble of screen all around you, and it's amazing. And like, suddenly now, this is clearly a vastly better way to do your work and do all kinds of stuff. I kind of feel like, if that was true, why don't we all have 70-inch screens on our desks? And why is it that actually most of us do most of our work now on our iPhones?
Right.
And I feel like this is skeuomorphism. It's like, there's this old joke that like, never invest in anything called virtual, because they're trying to do a crap copy of something in the real world instead of making something new. And it's a little bit like the shift to the cloud, which is this sort of narrative I always have. It's like you've got somebody in a big company and their job is to take data out of SAP into a CSV, put the CSV into Excel, make charts, put the charts into PowerPoint, make the slides, email them to everybody. And one brilliant day, somebody comes along and say, hey, we've got this cloud thing now. Instead of emailing everybody the PowerPoint, you could just put it on Google Drive. And then somebody says, no, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be using Google Slides. And these are both like, well, yes, but shouldn't SAP be making the charts?
Right. Yeah.
I was speaking to a friend of mine the other day at Facebook, and he's like, I just downloaded, this new iMac is so great. I just downloaded a 650 meg CSV and analyzed it. And I'm like, yeah, run me through that one again.
And how do you see AR?
The reason I say this is like, I don't think like more screen is the answer to any important question in productivity or in how we use our computers. Like more screen is interesting for some things. It's interesting basically for certain kinds of entertainment.
Yeah.
Would that make my Salesforce experience much better? Would it enable me to make some transformative new Salesforce thing? Isn't like the whole point of this shit to have less stuff on the screen? Like, isn't that the whole direction of travel, to have less buttons?
Yeah. But AR is distinctively different, obviously, from VR. And that you can tell a story about why the use cases for that ought to be a lot more generalist. Do you buy that?
It's interesting. So, I mean, AR, it feels a lot like talking about smartphones in like 2000. Okay, what's this going to be? Is everyone going to have one? Are you going to have a big one, a small one? You're going to have a PDA, you're going to have a keyboard. You're going to have a Bluetooth headset and a screen, but you leave the screen at home, and we had no idea what it was going to look like. I think there's a hard science problem in AR, which is you need to have something that looks more or less like this, that has a full set of cameras and sensors built in, that has compute equivalent to like a high-end smartphone now, whether that's wireless to the actual smartphone in your pocket or not. Maybe how Apple plans to do it to begin with. And then you need all the optics, so I can put something in the world that looks like it's really there, and then it works in broad daylight and has a good field of view, and so there's like a whole optics problem, and then a sensing problem, and then a compute and engineering problem. And then when you have that, okay, I've got a pair of glasses, I can look around. So Mark Andreessen had this sort of theory that like most people don't go anywhere. So like the whole narrative is like you're standing in the art gallery and you look at the picture and you see the Wikipedia entry, or, like I have a meeting and like I see your LinkedIn profile above your head and it's like that. The cynical case on this would be it's a little bit like in the mid 2000s when people were like really interested in location but had no clue what it would be. And the use case everyone would always say is you'll walk past a Starbucks and you'll get a pop-up on your phone saying you could have a cheap coffee. And here we are 15 years later, and we do use GPS all the time, but we don't do that with it.
Right.
And so there is this sort of, okay, if I wore a pair of glasses that could put stuff into the world around me, what would that be for? And like, it sounds great, but what? No, actually, what would that be? And like, I'm sure you've got a VR headset. I've got a VR headset. I've been on call. Half the people I have calls with are on VR headsets. I don't think it's literally never occurred to any of us to do these calls in VR.
Right.
And the same with AR. Like there is this sort of, so the bear case, again, I could talk about this all day. The bear case for VR is it's a subset of games consoles. It's a deep, intense, richly immersive experience. Most people do not want a games console. Most people see a games demo today and they go, that's very pretty. And you don't buy it.
Yeah.
Most people, if you'd shown somebody a PlayStation 5 in 1980, they would have said, oh my God, this is amazing. This is part of the future. Turns out that's 150 million units, which is a big business, but it's not 5 billion smartphones.
Yeah.
So that's the bear case for both VR and AR is it's very cool, but it's not, is it a universal experience? And I don't think we know. I mean, we were having this argument about mobile 20 years ago. Very cool. Well, is that like, will everyone do that? Or will that be like a niche thing? Is a smartphone a PC accessory? Turned out a PC is a smartphone accessory.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, that's what happened. Until about 2010, smartphones were PC accessories. Now PCs are smartphone accessories. Is that what happens to VR? Like, we don't know. Maybe.
Well, maybe then as a final topic, and with this sort of unifying theme theme of things that VCs hope would be trillion-dollar businesses. I mean, the other thing you've written a lot about is how autonomous vehicles, level 5 autonomous vehicles, are sort of 5 to 10 years away and have been for at least
5 to 10 years.
And where do you think we are with that right now? I mean, it feels in some ways like all the things that technologically needed to happen to make that happen have continued to move at the pace that we're moving.
So this comes back to machine learning. So machine learning meant that people said, oh, actually, this could work now. And it got us from it working very badly a little bit to working very well quite a lot. The trouble is very well quite a lot isn't good enough. And it's a classic case of like the last 10% being 90% of the work. And nobody working on this stuff thinks it's even close to working in a generalized sense yet. I think maybe the more interesting question is, what does working mean? And where, and I think it's a where rather than a when question. So, which is why like kind of full autonomy is kind of meaningless, because like full autonomy where? It's like I'm a way better driver when there's nobody else on the road than I am when there's other people around.
Yeah.
You know, I'd never have an accident if there were no other cars on the road. So like you can have a car, you could have a garbage truck that can follow the crew down the road at walking pace, and at the end of the road they get in and drive it home. You could say this medium-sized town says, well, we're autonomy only at the weekends. And that means you drive to a parking lot and you get into an autonomous golf cart. And the autonomous golf cart can only drive within this geo-bounded area, and there are no manually driven vehicles in that area. And suddenly that becomes, and you're only driving at 10 miles an hour. So suddenly this becomes a really easy, much easier problem.
Right.
Is that car fully autonomous? Well, it's fully autonomous at 10 miles an hour in this city when there's no manually driven vehicles around. So what does full autonomy mean? And I think that's sort of where we're going to go is, you know, freeway driving is way easier than cities.
Right.
For example. I think where it gets really challenging is the midpoint, where you have some human-driven vehicles and some not human-driven vehicles. And in particular, where you have a vehicle that is not fully autonomous, but somewhat autonomous. And the human being is supposed to be sitting in the car all the time with their hands like this, ready to grab the wheel at any moment. And this is why like 98% of people who work in autonomy look at Elon Musk and Tesla and say that is dangerous. Because it's not level 5. It's not anywhere close to level 5. It cannot drive itself in any meaningful sense if anything unexpected happens. And like it looks okay as long as nothing unexpected happens, but you don't know what it'll do when something unexpected happens. And it's not a good thing for a human being to be not driving and not paying attention and then suddenly have to be driving. And that's actually one of the kind of the challenges is it's way easier to make, in a sense, it's much, I'm trying to think of it, the middle case, the uncanny valley is the hard bit. It would be way easier if all the cars were autonomous.
And do you think, I mean, like you can imagine sort of, I mean, we have an office in Singapore, and you can sort of imagine somewhere like Singapore saying, we're just going to brute force that transition, you know, like
you can say like this is what's happening with electric,
right?
The German post office will say all vehicles are electric, or we're going to replace our fleet, we're going through the generational fleet change, the new vehicles will be electric because we've got a constrained scenario. We know exactly what the average mileage is, we know exactly when they can charge, we're just going to go electric. And Manhattan can say all delivery vehicles under certain criteria, all delivery vehicles have to be electric by this date. And they can do that. And that's like a practical thing you can say. And you can imagine saying that with some autonomy scenarios. If you say that, delivery vehicles at night, maybe certainly freeways, like the obvious thing, where you can say, you can make an autonomous truck much more easily than you can make a taxi in suburbs. So it's the where rather than the when question, I think, that comes up there.
And so do you think the where question for cities is just going to be never? Is that sort of your base case?
Oh, like, when do you have South Boston? When do you have Naples? When do you have Moscow? What is that hand signal actually telling you to do to your mother? Like, what does full autonomy mean? It's like saying, there's a Super Bear case that says that, the car that can drive from Moscow to Naples requires general AI, which in other words, like 50 years or never.
Yeah.
It requires that degree of understanding of what people are going to do. It's easy, but as creating constrained environments, then it becomes viable. I mean, you mentioned VC in the question. The thing that's become apparent is that, like, this is billions of dollars.
Right.
So we've seen both Uber and Lyft get out because they just said, we just don't have the cash flow to support. A, we don't have the cash flow to support this. B, actually, we don't think it's going to be somewhere thing we have to control. We think we'll just be able to go out and buy it when it happens. So we don't have to do it ourselves. And they don't have the money. Tesla basically gets away with it by actually not doing that CapEx. They're just free riding on the user base. But the problem with that is that means they don't have LiDAR, they don't have radar, they don't really even have high definition cameras. So they don't, they've got a very different kind of quality of data to everybody else. But there is this kind of interesting thing of, like, how much money is it going to take to get you there?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that Uber, there was a point when Uber was saying, maybe not fully openly, but, there was this sort of like meme that Uber required this to make their business model work in the long run. Like, without autonomy, driving costs are just too high. But it's kind of striking to see that reversal. Yeah,
I mean, it's a puzzle. I think there was a moment of euphoria when people thought, like, oh my God, this might actually work in like 3 years.
Yeah.
And I think you could also maybe fit that into a funding and valuation story. But it's become apparent, as I said, like, you went from not working at all. And then there's this famous DARPA challenge, I can't remember when it was. That was like 2010.
Yeah.
It's actually pre-machine learning. And like, you can get it to work sort of, but sort of isn't good enough. And that's become the question.
Yeah. Yeah, and as you say, like, maybe it's a bit like one of these sort of Bell Labs or Xerox PARC things where you kind of need to attach it to a massive monopoly with huge cash flows to fund it effectively forever and to make it work. All right, well, I think we're out of time, but Benedict, this has been and fascinating. So thank you so much. And Alex, thanks for joining us back. One thing, Alex, I realized you didn't say in your introduction is we're lucky to have you as one of our venture partners in Entrepreneur First in Toronto. So
I'm very fortunate, very lucky, and I think you guys are having a huge impact on the ecosystem because you bring a different approach to building startups here, and we have a lot of talent on the sidelines that would not be building up companies without you.
Well, as I say, we in 11 days' time, 25th of May, the investors on the call can check out the companies from the last cohort, and of course, applications are open for the next cohort. So, thanks so much for having us, Alex.
Thank you both for coming. Benedict, you've also made me happy because I told my son, who's 6 years old, he's not gonna, he can get a car and just drive when he gets a fully autonomous vehicle. So I basically telling him, no, I'm not gonna have any arguments in the next 5 to 10 years to have to worry about. Thank you both. I love the analysis. I love the questions. You covered so many topics so quick. Matt and Benedict, everyone in Canada is going to be slightly smarter and know more about the trends because you spent your time with us. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks. For you, everyone that's still here, thank you for joining us. If you missed any of our previous Founders and Funding episodes, you can catch up to them on TechTO's Founders and Funding podcast, available wherever you listen to podcasts. And today's episode will be up on Monday. And talking about Monday, if you have time at 7 p.m. Eastern, you should join us for our live stream then, because we're going to the prairies. We'll be bringing Michelle Romano from ClearCo back to our stage to talk about her new double unicorn status. And we'll also have Jordan Bosch, founder and CEO of 7 Shifts, talking about the journey of building his company. Michelle grew up in Regina, and 7 Shifts is headquartered in Saskatoon. So we want to shine a light on what's going on in the prairies. If you know companies that we should be talking about on Monday, feel free to email me, tweet at me, or tweet at TechTO. Now, if you had a good time, there's still quite a few people around here. We're going to open up for networking till 2:15. Get to know our other community members, and be kind. Spend time actually learning what they're doing and how you can help them. Thank you so much for joining us.